Hello, beautiful micro-philosophical community. Welcome to the Philosophy channel. We're going to do a little casual off-the-cuff talk about Isaiah Berlin's concept of value pluralism. If you follow my main channel or my chat channel, a lot of what I say actually has Berlin's value pluralism, which I think is right, as a background assumption. So it'll be illuminating for you to hear it, and for others who want to hear about Isaiah Berlin, you're very, very welcome. And we're going to do a short chat about his value pluralism today, but I'm planning some long-form lectures on Isaiah Berlin, health allowing, over the months to come. Speaking of health, it's because of health that I have this strange relationship with Berlin. Sort of 20 years ago, my PhD work was about Berlin. I've been thinking about Berlin for a few decades. I haven't brought out work about Berlin, largely for health reasons, but I hope to change that. Let's start. Berlin's conception of value pluralism basically consists of two claims. The first claim is that values conflict and are not reducible to one another. So think of all the values that there are: political values, ethical values, aesthetic values. Some of them will be universal, others will be culturally contingent, that it would have arisen in the last 200-300 years, perhaps, in the West. There is no way to say anything at a general and determinate level that will reconcile conflicts between values, such that we see that upon reflection, upon the illumination presented by a certain theory, values which we thought did conflict don't conflict, right? So nothing like the sort of thing that Rousseau wanted to do with equality and liberty is possible for Berlin. Equality and liberty conflict, and there is nothing you can say at a general level of philosophical reflection on ethics that'll bring it about that these values can be harmonized. And Rousseau, of course, would say, well, as long as you reflect properly on what these values really are, you're going to see they don't get in each other's way. And that's nonsense for Berlin. But the much more important claim that Berlin makes, the second part of his idea of value pluralism, is that values don't just conflict, but when they conflict, they're incommensurable with one another. And now the word incommensurability is a scary word that perhaps most notably comes our way from the philosophy of the sciences, philosophy of the natural sciences, where we might talk of incommensurability between conceptual schemes. That is not at all what Berlin is talking about. So what is he talking about when he says that values are incommensurable? What he means is that when two values conflict, it's not possible to arbitrate that conflict, to give one value priority over another, or give them equal priority at a general and determinate level. There are going to be all kinds of ways in which you might have good reason to prioritize one value over the other in a particular context of action, in a particular historical context. But among these reasons, you cannot find, unless you are deluded, some kind of general and determinate way of weighing the two values at conflict that's derived at the level of something like the theorization of the content of ethics. Indeed, insofar as the theorization of the content of ethics is supposed to arbitrate conflict between values. It's an impossibility, right? So at a general level of philosophical inquiry about values, when two values conflict, you cannot say that one has priority over the other, or that they have equal priority. You can't prioritize A over B, you can't prioritize B over A, and you can't say that they're of equal worth. Now, over and above that, Berlin had a very special rhetorical and personal inclination to underestimate how reasoned a choice between two conflicting values might be in a given practical case. And in that regard, he used the word plumping. You plump for one value over another. And that has absolutely nothing to do with his theoretical position about conflict and incommensurability of values. It doesn't follow from his position, his general position on the incommensurability of values, that it's going to be particularly difficult or indeed often impossible to find good reasons in practice to prioritize one value over another. All that follows from his conceptual position is that something like the move of a Kantian moral theorist who wants to admit that values conflict, but then say that they're commensurable because you can discover certain principles of right and justice and apply them to the values in conflict and thereby arbitrate that conflict at the level of generality and determinacy. That's what's impossible for Berlin conceptually, right? But from that, it doesn't follow that as a private citizen, a private person making decisions, as a political leader making decisions, he's not going to have regularly very, very good reasons to choose one way or another when, let's say, liberty and equality conflict in practice. Berlin partly exaggerated the degree to which that decision is going to feel arbitrary to you when you make it in practice, to drill home the point about the truth of incommensurability conceptually. And I think he also partly made it because he just had that kind of empirical view. But don't confuse that with the conceptual position, right? In practice, it might be possible to invoke all kinds of reasons when there's a conflict between equality and liberty. We might say that in our society we have had too much equality, so we've got to go for liberty now. We had too much liberty, so we've got to go for equality now. That's completely compatible with Berlin's conceptual position, as is the idea of discovering that in practice, once you reflect upon it, you can see that the conflict between the two values is less acute than you originally thought, right? And it is also possible to appeal to a third value at hand when two values are in conflict and use that third value to soften the conflict between the two values in practice. What you can't, however, do is give any general or determinate account of how that third value might resolve the conflict between values. So what have we got? We've got incommensurability as basically the position that at the general philosophical level, there is no way to say that value A is better or lesser or equal to value B. That's it. That doesn't mean that decisions in a particular context about conflict of values are going to be somehow arbitrary. Now, it's very important to understand the shape of values that Belin's talking about, because he introduces a big footnote in his lecture to Concepts of Liberty that emphasizes the internal complexity of values. And so what we said earlier was actually too caricatural. Belin doesn't think that equality is going to clash with liberty. What he thinks is that different conceptions of liberty and different conceptions of equality are going to clash with one another. One kind of conception of liberty clashing with one conception of equality, one conception of liberty clashing with one other conception of liberty. So it's very important that there is a pluralism within many of the values at hand. Furthermore, another important thing to understand is that Belin thought that some values were universal and others weren't. The values that weren't universal were values that just arose in particular cultural circumstances. So perhaps Isaiah's friend and colleague and student Charles Taylor would say that the value of authenticity is a value that arises in the West 2 or 3 centuries ago. Values that weren't culturally contingent were values that were essentially produced by the interaction of human nature and the mere semblance of the negotiation of social space by human beings. So let's take an example. Where does the value of freedom sit for Belin? For Belin, it's a universal value. And being a universal value, it's there before there is any history of anything, as long as human beings are there. So imagine 12 primitive humans are sitting in a cave. One of them wants to go to the river, but the leader of the group says, no, you're not going to go to the river. And so the one who wants to go to the river is going to feel negatively about that predicament. They're going to feel like they're being frustrated. They're going to feel like their desires or their projects are being impeded. They're going to feel that this is something that induces the desire to moan or to complain, or to feel like you've got to persuade into a different position the leader of your group. You're going to feel resentful. It doesn't matter what that is. It's just going to be naturally a negative reaction because you want to do something and it's important to you for some reason, but you're being told that you can't. What's going to happen next? Well, what's going to happen next is perhaps the leader of the group is going to give you some reasons why you shouldn't go to the river. It's too dangerous. You could give some reasons back. You could say, well, actually, I understand the argument that it's dangerous. It'd be a very good reason for why I shouldn't go to the river. But it's empirically false. It actually isn't dangerous, so maybe I can go to the river. Well, you've changed our mind about that, but surely if you go to the river today, you'll get fatigued. You won't be able to go to the river tomorrow and do the fishing. On that goes. So it's going to be negotiation of conflict between two human beings that starts with the frustration of somebody's projects and desires and then moves on to distinctions between more and less appropriate ways for somebody to frustrate somebody else's projects and desires. Well, that situation is already the incarnation of the universal value of freedom. What is very important for Belin is that this is going to be just a kernel of the value that is then going to be enormously differently elaborated in different cultural circumstances and hyperbolically elaborated. There are 200 different elaborations of the universal concept of freedom, of political freedom. So that's roughly what we've got. We've got a claim about conflict of values, and we've got a claim about incommensurability of values. Incommensurability of values doesn't mean that there's no sensible, appropriate, and rational way of arbitrating conflict between values in any given instance. All it means is that a general and determinate account at the level of ethical theory about how conflict ought to be arbitrated between two values is unavailable. And insofar as that is the purpose of ethical theory is an impossibility for Isaiah Berlin. Now, what kind of claim is this, that values are incompatible or incommensurable? I mean, it's an ethical claim, but it's also a metaethical claim. It's a claim about claims about ethics, right? It's a thought about ethics. But if it's a metaethical claim, what kind of metaethical claim is it? Well, I think Berlin's answer is just that cave where the 12 primitive humans are sitting and where they engage in conflict, right? So what produces the birth of the value of liberty in that case? It's the combination of human psychology and human rationality with the mere semblance of the negotiation of social space. So the metaethical claim for Berlin is not derived from some kind of metaphysical uplands. It's derived from basic conception of human motivation and human rationality, combined with an understanding of the basic conditions of social and political life. So it's a kind of psychological / anthropological orientation that gets Berlin to the conclusion that value pluralism is an objective truth about values. I think this will do for today. Let's love and catch you soon.